6 young women knelt in the dust outside Elias Kane's ranch. Their dresses torn, their faces streaked with blood and grit. They were begging for help from a man who hadn't spoken to another living soul in 3 years. And what they carried with them would force him to choose between the safety of his isolation and a fight against something far deadlier than loneliness. By the time he saw the blood on their hands, he knew turning them away would be the same as killing them himself. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I know how far my story has traveled. The sun was a hammer in the sky, beating down on the parched valley where Elias Kane had built his refuge. He stood on his porch, one hand gripping the weathered railing, his gaze fixed on a sight that didn't belong in his world anymore. 6 women, on their knees, dust clinging to their skin-torn dresses, flapping weakly in the hot wind. The youngest couldn't be more than 17, the oldest maybe 25. They looked like broken dolls dropped in the wrong place. Elias's throat felt like sandpaper. 3 years of silence had hardened his voice into something rusty, unused. 3 years since he'd chosen to cut every tie to the outside world. The auburn-haired one lifted her head first. Her eyes, green-sharp, even through exhaustion, met his. "Please," she rasped, barely more than a whisper. We ain't got nowhere else to go." Elias didn't move. "You need to leave," he said, his voice carrying across the dry air. "Can't help you." Her lips cracked as she tried to form words, but instead her knees wobbled and she pressed a hand to her side. Dark red spread across her palm. He swore under his breath. The other 5 shuffled closer, trying to keep her upright. That's when Elias saw the rope burns deep, angry grooves around their wrists, bruises on their arms. One girl's throat marked with finger-shaped shadows. His hands tightened on the railing. Every instinct told him to walk back inside, close the door, pretend he'd never seen them. He'd learned the hard way that helping strangers meant losing everything. But then the auburn-haired woman said something that pinned him in place. "They're hunting us," she said, her voice trembling. "Been 3 days, took our wagon, killed our guide." Elias's jaw worked. "Who's hunting you?" Her eyes darted to the horizon. "Men, 6 of them, and they ain't stopping." It was then he heard it, faint at first, then growing clearer. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming fast. He looked past the fence to the open desert. The sound wasn't just a noise, it was a countdown, a death clock ticking toward the women kneeling in his yard. The auburn-haired one's hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "You're the only soul between here and the border, please." He tried to shake her off, but her grip, slick with blood, didn't loosen. "You'll die out there," he said finally. "We'll die here too," she answered. A gust of wind lifted the edge of her dress, revealing bruises along her ribs. Elias cursed again, stepped off the porch, and before he realized what he was doing, he had scooped the youngest girl, burning with fever, into his arms. She was light as a sack of grain. "You can walk," he called to the others. They nodded weakly. One muttered, "We can make it." "Then move," he ordered. They stumbled toward the cabin, supporting each other. Elias kept glancing at the horizon dust, rising now, the rhythm of the horses faster. Inside, the women collapsed onto the narrow bed, the floor, anywhere they could find space. The cabin had always felt enough for him. Now it seemed impossibly small. He shut the door, bolted it, and said, "You've got maybe 10 minutes to tell me exactly what kind of trouble you've brought to my front yard." The auburn-haired woman, Clara, swallowed her eyes hard despite the pain. "Slavers," she said. "And the one leading them wears a federal badge." Outside, the hoofbeats drew closer. The sound of hoofbeats was no longer distant. It was a steady, pounding rhythm that pressed against the cabin walls like a heartbeat. Elias moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutters. Heat shimmered over the open ground, and in that haze, he saw them 6 riders cresting the far ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky. The lead man sat tall, his posture loose but commanding, as if he owned the land beneath him. Even from this distance, the glint of something metallic on his chest caught the sun. A badge. Elias's stomach tightened. He'd hoped Clara had been mistaken. She wasn't. Clara was sitting against the wall, her breath uneven, one hand pressed firmly to her wounded side. Her green eyes flicked toward the window. "That's him," she said softly. "Marshall Wade Harlan. He's the one who sold us." The name was a splinter under Elias's skin. Marshal, he repeated, his tone edged with disbelief and bitterness. A lawman running flesh. Not the first, Clara replied grimly. But the worst. He's got connections in 3 territories. If you hand us over, we disappear. If you help us, you disappear. Elias turned from the window and began checking his rifle, working the lever, just to feel the smooth weight of it again. How many men? 6 today. Could be more tomorrow. These ones. They're the hunters. Outside, the riders had slowed their pace, the dust cloud drifting lazily around them as they began to fan out. Elias knew the tactic cut off every avenue of escape before coming in for the kill. He'd seen it before years ago in another place on a day he'd rather forget. He looked back at the women. You can't outrun them, not in your state. We weren't planning to, Clara said, a hint of defiance breaking through her exhaustion. We were hoping to find someone who wouldn't hand us back. A bitter smile tugged at Elias's mouth. I'm not in the habit of inviting trouble to my door. Maybe not, Clara said, but trouble just knocked. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Elias heard the creak of saddle leather outside, the murmur of low voices. The riders were close enough now that he could make out the deep, deliberate tone of Wade Harlan giving orders. The man's voice carried authority, the kind that didn't come from a badge alone. Elias moved to the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He unlatched it, but didn't step outside yet. Instead, he glanced back at the women. Keep quiet. No matter what you hear. Clara's gaze locked with his. They'll search. They'll have to get past me first, he said. When Elias stepped onto the porch, the heat hit him like a wall. The riders had stopped just outside rifle range, close enough for him to see their eyes cold flat measuring him. Wade Harlan sat in the center, his black vest dusty but well kept, the star-shaped badge gleaming against it. Afternoon friend Harlan called, his voice smooth as polished stone. We're looking for some runaway property. 6 women. You seen anyone like that around here? Elias let the silence stretch before answering. Can't say that I have. Don't get many visitors. Harlan smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. That's so. Then you won't mind if we take a look around. Sometimes folks hide things they think no one will find. This is private land, Elias said evenly. And I didn't invite you. One of the riders, a thick-shouldered brute with a jagged scar down his cheek, spat into the dust. Federal authority trumps private land, old man. You hiding something? Elias rested his hand on the rifle but kept it pointed toward the ground. Not hiding, just not welcoming. Harlan swung down from his horse, moving with a casual grace that came from a lifetime of dangerous work. His boots crunched in the dirt as he stepped forward. Funny thing about men who choose to live alone, he said. They usually have secrets. What's yours? Elias didn't answer. He was too busy calculating distances, angles, and the odds, none of which looked good. Behind him, a faint noise broke the tension, a small, stifled sound. Harlan's head turned slightly. What was that? Elias said quickly. Loose board. But the marshal's hand had already drifted toward his pistol. I think we're going to take a little tour of your place. If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem. The other 5 dismounted in unison, their boots hitting the ground in near-perfect rhythm. Elias knew that rhythm. It was the sound of trained men closing in. He took one slow step forward, closing the space between himself and Wade Harlan until there were only a few feet between them. His voice was low but steady. You cross this porch, you'd better be ready for what comes next. Harlan's smile sharpened. I was born ready, Kane. The name hit Elias like a slap. No one here should have known it, not after all this time. You remember me, Harlan said softly, leaning in just enough for his words to cut through the heat. I remember you. Elias's fingers flexed against the rifle stock. He could feel the past pressing in heavy and suffocating. Whatever happened next, there would be no undoing it. And from the way Harlan's eyes glittered, the man knew it too. Elias felt the air between them tighten, like a drawn wire. Harlan's smirk was one he remembered, lazy on the surface, hiding something sharp underneath. It had been 3 years, but the man's face hadn't changed much, just more lines at the corners of his eyes, more shadows that came from doing bad work for too long. You've got the wrong place, Elias said, but his voice lacked the easy lie of a man with nothing to hide. Harlan's gaze roamed over the porch up to the cabin windows, where the shutters were drawn tight. You always keep the place locked up this tight. Looks more like you're keeping something in than keeping people out. Elias didn't answer, and that silence was a crack. Harlan slid right into. I think you've got something of mine in there, the marshal said. 6 women ran off without settling their debts. They're not yours, Elias said. The words came out colder than he intended, but there was no taking them back. Not yours either, Harlan replied. Unless you're making a claim. That what you're doing, Cain. The name again. Elias could feel the weight of it pressing against the past he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. I told you you've got the wrong man. Harlan took another step forward, closing the distance until Elias could smell the desert dust on his coat. I don't think I do. Cain. Willow Creek. You remember, the images came unbidden. Sarah's face pale in the lamplight. Harlan standing in the doorway of their home with that same smirk, the sound of her voice telling him to run. His jaw tightened. You've got no business here, Elias said, voice low. I had business with you once, Harlan murmured just loud enough for the other men to hear if they strained. You failed it then, and I'm betting you'll fail it now. Hand them over. No. That one word seemed to shift the air. The men behind Harlan straightened their hands, drifting toward their gun belts. Somewhere inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. Harlan's head tilted slightly toward the noise. Sounds like your place is talking Cain. Elias shifted his stance, his rifle coming up, not quite aimed, but close enough that it wasn't a bluff anymore. You're not stepping through that door. Harlan's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake. And you know what's funny about mistakes out here? The desert don't remember them long, but the buzzards do. You should ride out while you can, Elias said. I think we'll stay. Harlan turned his head slightly, speaking over his shoulder. Boys? The order was cut short by a voice from inside the cabin, weak but fierce. He's lying, Elias, about Sarah. Elias's blood went cold. Clara. Harlan's smirk faltered just for a flicker of a second. Careful, darling. Men who talk too much tend to stop breathing. But Clara didn't stop. She didn't die calling for him. She died fighting. She believed you'd come for her. Elias's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles ached. The guilt he'd carried for years wavered a crack forming in its foundation. Harlan's gaze snapped back to him. Don't listen. She's spinning you a story because she wants you to die for her. Elias stared at him, the noise of the horses shifting restlessly behind the marshal, fading into the background. You took her, he said. I took what I was owed, Harlan replied flatly. You couldn't pay and you wouldn't fight. That's on you. Elias's vision narrowed to the space between them, the sunlight glaring off the badge pinned to Harlan's chest. His fingers settled against the trigger. Not this time. For a long moment they stood like that, 2 men with years of unfinished business between them, the heat shimmering in the air as if the whole valley was holding its breath. Then Harlan's hand dropped toward his holster. The rifle cracked before it cleared leather. The force knocked Harlan back off his feet, dust exploding around him as he hit the ground. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the startled snort of a horse. And then all at once the yard erupted. Gunfire exploded in the yard the instant Wade Harlan's body hit the dirt. Bullets chewed into the porch posts and ripped splinters from the door frame. Elias dropped to one knee, working the rifle's lever with a speed that came from old muscle memory. His first shot took a rider square in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The others were fanning out, firing from behind their horses, using the animals as cover. Elias ducked back toward the cabin door, shouting, "Stay down," over the roar of gunfire. But the answer that came was not obedience. It was Clara's voice, sharp and defiant. "I'm not staying down," she said, and when the door swung open, she stood there with his old double-barrel shotgun braced against her hip. Her face was pale, her dress soaked dark at the side, but her hands were steady. She fired both barrels into the nearest man, the blast echoing off the canyon walls. He toppled from his horse, clutching his chest. "Root cellar," she yelled over the chaos, tossing the empty shotgun aside. More weapons down there. Elias fired again, driving another man back behind his mount, then moved to cover the doorway. "Go!" he barked. "Get what you can carry." Inside boots thudded against the floorboards as the women scrambled to obey. Moments later, they returned each armed with something from his hidden cache. Pistols, an old Winchester, even a battered Navy revolver he'd kept for reasons he couldn't name until now. The sight of them wounded, shaking, but with eyes burning, hit Elias like a second wind. They'd been running for days, barely able to stand, but now they fought like they had nothing left to lose. Gunfire cracked from the cabin windows, forcing the attackers to scatter. One of them, a wiry man with a bandana over his face, tried to make a run for the porch, but Clara met him with a clean shot to the leg that dropped him screaming into the dust. Two left, Elias shouted, counting the riders still firing from the far side of the yard. They're falling back. The youngest woman called, her fever-bright eyes peeking through a gap in the shutters. She was right. The two remaining men were spurring their horses toward the ridge, dragging the wounded behind them. The sound of retreating hoofbeats grew fainter, swallowed by the desert heat. Then there was silence. Elias rose slowly, scanning the ridge for any sign of a second wave. None came. His breathing was heavy sweat running into his eyes, but his hands were steady as he lowered the rifle. The yard was a mess, bodies sprawled in the dust, the porch pitted with bullet holes, the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging in the air. Wade Harlan lay where he'd fallen, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Clara stepped up beside Elias, her face tight with pain, but her gaze fixed on the man who had hunted her. "He's really gone?" she asked. Elias looked down at the marshal, the badge still glinting faintly in the sun. "Yeah, he's gone." Her shoulders sagged, but it wasn't relief. It was something heavier, the slow release of fear that had been wound too tight for too long. The women began to emerge from the cabin one by one, some limping, some holding bandaged arms, all of them looking to Elias as though waiting for him to tell them what came next. He didn't have an answer yet. Clara knelt briefly, not close enough to touch Harlan, but near enough to see his face clearly. "He took everything from us," she said quietly. "From you too. I just wish Sarah could have seen this." Elias didn't speak. His chest felt tight, but not in the same way it had for the last 3 years. There was something new there, something like breathing after holding your lungs empty for too long. One of the older women touched his arm gently. "They'll come back," she said. "Men like him always have more." Elias nodded. "Then we make sure we're gone before they do." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of blood, and spent powder away from the yard. In the distance, the sun was sliding lower, casting long shadows across the ridge. Elias knew that by nightfall the vultures would come for the dead. By morning, there'd be nothing left but the memory of what had happened here. But for the living, there was no time to linger. They needed water, food, a plan. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias realized he wasn't thinking about what was safest for himself. He was thinking about how to keep 6 strangers alive in a land that wanted them dead. He glanced back at the cabin, then toward the open desert, his mind already turning over routes, supply caches, places he could disappear into if he had to. Somewhere out there was a way forward. They just had to move before the next shadow fell across his land. Elias didn't waste time once the silence settled. He kicked the nearest fallen rifle toward one of the women, then moved to Harlan's horse and stripped its saddlebags. Inside, he found a half-empty canteen, a folded map marked with supply routes, and a packet of papers sealed with the marshal's stamp. He shoved them under his arm without looking twice. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a man who'd already made the decision. Clara, leaning against the porch rail for balance, studied his face. "You've got a plan." "I've got a direction," he replied. "East. There's a gulch 2 days' ride from here with water and shelter. From there we can decide what's next." The younger women exchanged uncertain glances. "We don't have horses," one said. Elias nodded toward the corral, where 3 of Harlan's mounts still stood stamping nervously. "Now we do." He moved quickly, checking tack and reins, cutting extra rope into makeshift lead lines. The women followed his instructions without argument, but their exhaustion showed. Every movement cost them. Clara caught him by the arm as he passed. "If they were this close today, the others won't be far behind. You kill a man like Harlan, word travels fast." "That's why we leave before dark," Elias said. "They'll expect me to dig in here. We're going to do the opposite." Inside the cabin, he gathered what supplies he could: dried beans, jerky, a coil of canvas. His hands hesitated over a small framed photograph on the shelf. Sarah's face, smiling in the spring sunlight, looked back at him. He slipped it into his pack without a word. When he came out, the women were mounted awkwardly, some clinging to the saddle horns, others holding on to one another. Clara had claimed Harlan's black gelding sitting tall despite her wound. "You sure you can ride?" he asked. Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Not sure, but I'll try." They set off eastward, the desert swallowing the sound of their passing. The sun hung low, bleeding orange into the sky, casting their shadows long across the sand. For the first hour, no one spoke. The silence was not the companionable kind, it was taut wary. Elias kept scanning the horizon, every glint of light or swirl of dust making his grip tighten on the reins. Finally, Clara spoke. "You didn't have to help us. Why did you?" Elias kept his eyes ahead. "Because I've been on the other side of that door, and I know what it's like when no one opens it." She was quiet for a moment. Sarah would be proud. He didn't answer, but the words settled somewhere deep where the guilt used to be heavier. As night crept in, the air cooled. They found a narrow arroyo to make camp, the walls offering some shelter from the wind. Elias built a small fire, keeping it low to avoid drawing attention. The women huddled close, sharing canteens and tearing strips from what little food they had. One of them, the fevered girl with hair like corn silk, sat shivering despite the warmth. Elias crouched beside her, feeling her forehead. "She needs rest and water. We push her too hard, she won't make it." "We can't slow down," Clara said quietly from across the fire. Elias looked at her. "If we don't, we'll lose her." It was a standoff of a different kind. Clara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "We'll stop before sunup, just long enough for her to drink." The others were already drifting toward uneasy sleep, but Elias stayed awake, the rifle across his knees. His mind turned over the map he'd taken from Harlan's bag, the marked routes and notations in the margins. Some of the marks he recognized Waterhole's relay stations, but others were unfamiliar. He wondered if they were meeting points for men like Harlan, places where business was done far from the eyes of any honest law. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest echo of something that made him sit straighter hoofbeats. Distant, faint, but moving at a steady clip. He rose and stepped away from the fire, scanning the horizon through the narrow gap in the arroyo wall. There, just on the edge of moonlight, a dust trail. Small, but growing. When he returned to the fire, Clara was already awake, watching him. "They're coming, aren't they?" "Not tonight," Elias said. "But they're behind us. And they're closing." She didn't flinch, only pulled her blanket tighter. "Then we'll just have to be faster." Elias stared into the fire, listening to it pop and crackle. Faster might not be enough. Out here, speed didn't always save you. Sometimes the only thing that did was making sure the other side never got back up. He glanced at the rifle leaning against the rock, then at the women sleeping in a rough half-circle around the flames. The choice he'd made at his cabin wasn't the last one. It was just the first. By first light, the fire was nothing more than a bed of faintly glowing coals. Elias had not slept. His eyes fixed on the narrow opening of the arroyo where the pale sky bled into the jagged horizon. The dust trail he'd spotted in the night was gone now, swallowed by the darkness, but he knew it was out there still. Men riding with purpose, following sign only the trained could read. He nudged the embers with his boot, stirring enough heat to warm the tin of water he'd set by the fire. Clara stirred from where she'd been propped against her saddle, wincing as she shifted her injured side. "Morning," she said, her voice rough. "Drink," he replied, handing her the tin. She took a sip and passed it back. "You gonna tell them?" Elias looked toward the women still sleeping in the shelter of the arroyo wall. "Not yet. No sense in starting the day with panic." Her eyes searched his. "But you know they're coming." "I know," he said, "which means we move now, before the sun's high enough to turn this place into an oven." Within minutes, they were packing the few supplies they had. Elias helped the fevered girl, Grace Clara, had called her onto a horse, then tightened the cinches on the others' saddles. When they rode out, the shadows were still long across the sand, but the heat was already rising. They traveled in silence for hours, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying them east. Elias rode at the front, scanning for movement, while Clara brought up the rear, her eyes never leaving the horizon behind them. By midday, they crested a low ridge, and the land ahead unfolded into a stretch of hardpan dotted with mesquite and cactus. In the far distance, the faint shimmer of water marked the gulch Elias had promised. Relief flickered in him, but it was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a cluster of dark shapes breaking away from the line of low hills to the north. He reined in hard. "Riders," he called back. Clara's head snapped up. "How many Too many," he said. 8, maybe more. And they're not wandering, they're hunting. The women's faces paled. One of them whispered, "Harlan's men." "Maybe the rest of them," Elias said, already scanning the terrain. "Could be others like him." Clara nudged her horse up beside his. "If we push for the gulch, can we make it before they cut us off?" "Not at this pace," he said. "But if we split, no." Her tone was sharp enough to cut the thought off before it formed. "We stay together. You go one way, they'll follow you, and we're back where we started cornered." Elias weighed her words, watching the riders close the distance. Dust rose behind them in a long, low plume. "All right," he said finally. "Then we make them work for it." He led them down the slope into a shallow wash that snaked eastward, the walls high enough to hide them for a stretch. The horses' hooves kicked up damp sand as they moved at a steady trot. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the occasional shouted command carrying on the wind. An hour later, the wash opened into a dry flat, and there was no more cover, only the blinding white glare of sun on sand. Clara drew up alongside him, her jaw set. "They're close enough now I can see their faces," she said. Elias glanced back. She was right. The men were maybe a mile off, riding hard, their formation tight. "Another hour, and they'll be on us," he said. Grace swayed in her saddle, her face flushed with fever. Elias slowed his horse to ride beside her, steadying her with one hand. "Stay with me," he said quietly. I'm trying," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thud of hooves. By the time they reached the first rise of the gulch, Elias knew they couldn't outrun them. The riders had closed to within half a mile, their shouts clear now. He pulled up sharply. "We're not going to make it in," he said. "We hold them here." Clara's eyes locked with his. "Can we win?" "Maybe," he said. "If we make them pay for every foot they take." The women dismounted, moving with the weary precision of people who had been here before. Elias took the Winchester from his saddle scabbard and handed it to Clara. "You remember how to use one of these?" Her grip was steady. "I don't forget." They took positions behind the rise, the heat pressing down like a weight. Elias could see the riders now, faces, hard eyes, locked on their prey. The lead man raised his arm, and the line began to spread. "Wait," Elias murmured, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. "Don't waste a shot." The first volley came when they were close enough to smell the horse's sweat. Elias's rifle cracked, dropping the lead rider from his saddle. Clara fired a heartbeat later, and another man pitched sideways into the dust. The rest thundered forward, and the desert erupted into chaos. The first rush hit like a storm. Hooves pounded the hardpan, throwing up clods of dust that stung the eyes and burned the throat. Elias worked the lever of his rifle without thinking, the sharp metallic snap and the thud of each shot merging into a rhythm older than memory. 2 riders went down in quick succession, their horses veering off in panic. "Reload," he shouted, ducking behind the low rise as a spray of bullets chewed into the sand around him. Clara dropped to one knee beside him, sliding fresh cartridges into the Winchester with hands that didn't shake despite the heat and blood loss. "They're flanking us," she said, nodding toward a pair of riders breaking off to the right. Elias spat dust from his mouth. "Not if I can help it." He rose just high enough to fire, catching one in the chest. The man crumpled forward, tangled in his reins, his horse dragging him across the ground. The second wheeled away, firing wildly over his shoulder. The other women scattered along the rise, fired in bursts, ducking low between shots. Grace, too weak to stand, sat propped against a rock with a pistol braced in both hands. Her shot was slow, but deliberate, and the cry from a rider pitching off his mount told Elias she'd hit her mark. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ragged shouts of men trying to push through a defense they hadn't expected. Elias counted at least 4 still coming hard, their eyes fixed on the narrow gap where the rise dipped toward the gulch. "They're trying to break through the middle," one of the older women yelled. "Let them try," Elias answered, dropping another cartridge into the chamber. He waited until they were close enough that he could see the whites of their eyes, then squeezed the trigger. The lead horse stumbled, crashing to the ground, its rider rolling clear but not fast enough to avoid the follow-up shot. One of the attackers pulled up short, shouting something Elias couldn't make out over the roar in his ears. A moment later, the remaining riders turned hard, breaking away and circling out of range. "They're pulling back," Clara said, panting. "For now." Elias didn't lower his rifle. He watched the men retreat to a low ridge a few hundred yards out where they regrouped. They were still there, silhouettes against the sky, unmoving. "They're not leaving," he said grimly. "They're waiting us out." The women shifted uneasily, murmuring among themselves. The brief surge of victory was already fading, replaced by the heavy knowledge that the fight wasn't over. Elias knelt beside Grace, checking her pulse. She was clammy, her breath shallow, but her eyes were sharp. "Did we win?" she asked, voice hoarse. "For now," he told her. "But we've got to move before they decide to come again." Clara joined him, crouching low. "They've seen how we fight. They'll come back smarter." Elias nodded. "They've got more horses, more water. We stay here, we lose." He stood and scanned the gulch beyond the rise. The narrow passage twisted east, its high walls offering cover, but also the risk of ambush. Still, it was the only way forward. "We ride in 10 minutes, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Clara didn't protest. She went to help the others gather what little they had left. Half-empty canteens, the weapons they could carry, a handful of cartridges rattling in a cloth pouch. When they mounted again, the riders on the ridge didn't move, but Elias could feel their eyes on every step. He kept his own gaze forward, guiding the group down into the gulch, the walls rising high on either side. The heat down here was worse, trapping the air until it shimmered. The sound of hooves echoed off the stone, making it impossible to tell if they were alone. Clara rode up alongside him, her hand resting lightly on the butt of her rifle. "You think they'll follow us in?" she asked. "They'd be fools not to," he said. And Harlan didn't hire fools. They pressed on the gulch, twisting and narrowing until it felt like the walls were closing in. Every bend was a blind turn, and Elias's nerves wound tighter with each one. He could sense the women behind him feeling it too, their breathing quiet, the creak of leather and the clink of metal, the only sounds. A hawk's cry echoed somewhere above, sharp and sudden. Elias glanced up, scanning the rim of the gulch, and froze. A shadow shifted against the rock, then another. "Riders," he said under his breath. "On the walls." Clara looked up, her eyes narrowing. "They've been waiting for us." The first shot rang out from above, shattering rock inches from Elias's head. He spurred his horse forward, shouting, "Ride now," as more gunfire erupted from both sides of the gulch. Gunfire poured down from the rim like a summer hailstorm, bullets sparking off the rock walls and ricocheting into the dust around them. Horses reared and screamed, their hooves slipping on loose stone. Elias leaned low over his saddle, shouting for the women to keep moving, his voice swallowed by the thunder of hooves and gunfire. Clara was right beside him, her gelding surging forward despite the narrow trail. She raised her rifle one-handed, firing toward the shapes on the rim. One of the silhouettes jerked back, tumbling from the edge to hit the gulch floor with a sickening thud. "They'll box us in," she called over the din. "Not if we break through." "First," Elias snapped. He scanned ahead. The gulch curved sharply to the left, and beyond it he thought he could see daylight widening into an open stretch. It wasn't safety, but it was space to maneuver. "Push for that bend," he shouted, kicking his horse harder. The group surged forward, the sound of gunfire still chasing them, but the steep angle of the walls gave them brief pockets of cover. A shot rang out close, striking a stone beside Grace and showering her with dust. She flinched, clutching the saddle horn, but kept her seat. They rounded the bend, and for a brief moment the gunfire thinned. Elias risked a glance back. The attackers on the rim were scrambling to reposition their vantage, lost in the curve, but he knew they wouldn't give up. "Keep riding," he barked, even as the horses' sides heaved and their flanks darkened with sweat. Ahead, the gulch spilled into a wider basin scattered with scrub and rock outcroppings. The air felt different here, more open, but also more exposed. Clara pulled alongside him again, her eyes scanning the far ridges. "They'll be on us in minutes," she said. "What's your play?" Elias slowed just enough to let the women draw closer together. "We make them come to us. If they've got the high ground, we're done. But out here, we pick our spot." He led them toward a cluster of boulders half buried in the basin floor. From there, they could cover the approaches from 3 sides. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than waiting to be picked off in the open. They dismounted quickly, tying the horses low behind the rocks. Elias took the Winchester from Clara long enough to check the chamber, then handed it back. 2 shots, then move, he told her. Don't give them a target to walk in on. The women spread out as best they could, ducking behind stone and scrub. Grace sat with her back to a boulder, her pistol balanced in her lap, the fever burning in her cheeks but her gaze sharp. It didn't take long. The first riders appeared at the basin's edge, their silhouettes black against the glare of the sky. They came in slow, cautious, fanning out to encircle the rocks. Elias waited until the lead man was close enough for him to see the dust on his coat before he fired. The rider toppled sideways, hitting the ground hard. Clara's shot followed a heartbeat later, and another man went down. The basin erupted into chaos, gunfire, shouts, the crash of hooves on stone. Elias moved between positions, firing from one and then another before the enemy could pin him down. The women fought like they had at the rise, their shots deliberate, their movements quick, despite the fatigue dragging at them. A rider broke through on the left, charging toward the cover where 2 of the women were crouched. Elias spun and fired the shot, catching the horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed, collapsing mid-stride and throwing its rider headfirst into the dirt. "They're falling back again," Clara called, peering over her rifle. Elias didn't believe it until he saw the men retreating to the basin's edge, their horses wheeling in tight arcs before disappearing over the ridge. The sudden quiet felt heavy, every breath loud in his ears. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. "That's twice we've pushed them off. There won't be a third without cost." Clara lowered her rifle, sweat tracing pale lines through the dust on her face. "Then we move before they decide to try again." Elias agreed, but his mind was already calculating how far they could get before dark and whether the next fight would be worse than the last. The truth was, he didn't know if any of them had another battle left in them. Still, he looked around at the women, bruised, bloodied, but standing, and he knew one thing for certain. Turning back wasn't an option. They rode hard out of the basin, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the sweat of overworked horses. Every jolt in the saddle pressed against their exhaustion, but Elias pushed them on, eyes fixed on the pale line of horizon ahead. The sun was dropping fast, throwing long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the ground. Clara's horse pulled up alongside his, her voice low but steady. "You think they'll follow tonight?" "They'd be fools not to," he said. "But they'll need to regroup. That gives us a sliver of time if we use it." She glanced at the women trailing behind their movements, stiff, their faces pale beneath layers of dust. "We're burning them out, Elias. Grace won't last if we keep this pace." He looked back at the girl. She was swaying in the saddle, her eyelids heavy, but her hands still clutched the reins like she was afraid to let go. "We stop when we find cover," he said, though the words were more promise than plan. An hour later, the land dipped into a narrow cut between 2 ridges, the walls high and jagged. It wasn't perfect, but it offered concealment. Elias signaled the group to halt, and the horses stopped with grateful snorts, their sides heaving. "Off," he said. "We'll rest here." The women dismounted slowly, some collapsing to the ground as soon as their feet touched it. Elias loosened the girths and let the horses drink from the single canteen they'd been sharing, careful to ration it. Clara knelt beside Grace, tipping a small cup of water to her lips. "She's burning up," Clara said quietly. Elias crouched, resting a hand on the girl's forehead. "She needs more than water. She needs time." "We don't have time." Clara answered, her tone clipped but not unkind. The words sat between them like a stone neither wanted to move. Elias stood and scanned the ridges. The last of the light was slipping away, the sky bruising into deep purples and reds. Somewhere out there, men were watching for the flicker of a fire or the sound of a misplaced hoof. As darkness settled, they huddled close, speaking in low voices. One of the older women, her hands blistered from holding the reins, said, "If they catch us, it won't be quick." "No," Elias agreed, "it won't." Clara studied him through the shadows. "You've been thinking about something. Say it." He hesitated. "We could use the gulch ahead to set an ambush. Pick them off before they even know we're waiting." The women exchanged uneasy glances. "And if it goes wrong?" one asked. "Then we keep riding," Elias said. "But they'll keep coming until someone stops them for good." Clara's eyes held his, and in that look was an understanding that went deeper than words. "You're talking about ending this. I'm talking about giving you a chance to reach somewhere they won't follow." The conversation died there, but the weight of it lingered. They took turns sleeping Elias, staying awake longer than the rest, his rifle across his knees. The night was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hummed with hidden movement. Just before dawn, the faint crunch of stone reached his ears. He rose without a sound, moving to the edge of the ridge. Down below in the half-light, he saw them 3 riders scouting ahead, their horses picking carefully through the rocks. They weren't charging, they were tracking. Elias slid back into the shadows and woke Clara with a touch to her shoulder. "They've found us," he murmured. Her hand went to her rifle. "Then we move now." "No," he said. "We make them come to us. Wake the others quietly." By the time the women were ready, the scouts had withdrawn, no doubt, to bring the rest. Elias led the group deeper into the cut, where the walls narrowed enough to force riders into single file. They took positions behind the rocks, the tension thick in the cool morning air. Clara settled beside him, her breathing steady despite the tightness in her jaw. "We only get one shot at this. Then we make it count," he said. The first hoofbeats reached them like a distant drum, slow. At first, then building. Shadows shifted at the entrance of the cut, and the glint of metal caught the early sun. Elias raised his rifle, the stock warm against his cheek. "Wait," he whispered. The riders entered the bottleneck, unaware of what waited in the gloom ahead. The first rider eased into the narrow cut, his horse's hooves clinking against loose stone. Behind him came another, then a third, each man scanning the shadows, but finding only jagged rock. They rode in single file, the walls too tight for anything else. Elias lay low behind a boulder, his finger resting on the trigger, watching the lead rider's eyes. When the man's head turned slightly toward a patch of brush, concealing 2 of the women, Elias fired. The shot cracked through the morning stillness, echoing up the walls. The lead man pitched sideways, hitting the ground hard, his rifle skittering away. The gulch exploded in chaos. Clara's Winchester barked from her perch on the opposite side, her shot dropping the second rider before he could wheel his horse. The third man tried to spin around, but the tight walls trapped him between falling bodies and panicked mounts. One of the women stepped out from behind cover, her pistol steady, and fired point blank into his chest. The narrow space turned the sound into thunder. Horses' reared eyes rolling white, blocking the path for the rest of the men still outside. Shouts erupted, orders barked in panic. Elias chambered another round and fired into the crush at the mouth of the cut, the bullet finding a rider's shoulder and spinning him off his saddle. "They're stuck," Clara shouted over the din. "Keep it that way," Elias called back, moving to a new position before firing again. Bullets sparked against the rocks where he'd been a heartbeat earlier, sending splinters into the air. The attackers were returning fire, blindly, their shots ricocheting off the walls. Grace, pale but determined, knelt behind a low outcrop, her pistol steady despite her trembling arms. She squeezed the trigger, the shot finding a man trying to climb the wall for a better angle. He tumbled back, cursing, until he hit the ground. The fight was a blur of noise and dust, the air thick with the acrid tang of spent powder. The women fought like they had nothing left to lose, each one holding her ground, even as the odds pressed in. Elias moved from rock to rock, firing in short, deliberate bursts, conserving the precious few rounds they had left. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, the frantic bray of a wounded horse, followed by the clatter of retreat. Elias risked a glance toward the mouth of the cut. The attackers were pulling back, dragging their wounded with them, the path littered with the dead. "Hold your fire," he shouted, and the echoes slowly faded into silence. For a long moment no one moved. The only sounds were the labored breathing of the horses and the low moans of the injured, both theirs and the enemy's. Elias lowered his rifle, his shoulders heavy, and stepped into the open. Clara emerged from her position, her face streaked with dust and sweat. "That's 3 times now," she said. "How many more before they stop coming?" Elias looked down the length of the cut where the retreating men were already vanishing into the distance. "As many as it takes," he said, though the words felt more like a burden than a boast. They gathered quickly, checking each other for wounds. 2 of the women had grazes where bullets had torn through clothing, but none were beyond repair. Grace's fever still burned her skin hot against Elias's palm when he steadied her in the saddle. "We can't keep fighting like this," Clara said quietly, standing close enough that only he could hear. "If we don't get her to water and shelter soon—" She let the thought die there. Elias's eyes met hers. "There's a town east of here," he said. Small out of the way. Folks there mind their own business. If we can reach it, we can buy a little time. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for something doubt, hesitation, but found none. She nodded. Then we ride now, before they circle around. They mounted without another word, the horses skittish from the scent of blood, but willing. Elias led them out of the cut and into the open, his eyes sweeping the ridges for any sign of movement. The sun was climbing, the heat pressing down again, but they pushed on the memory of the ambush still fresh in every breath. Behind them, the gulch lay quiet, the dust settling over the bodies left where they fell. Ahead the land stretched in a wavering ribbon of heat and distance, every mile a gamble. Elias tightened his grip on the reins, knowing the fight wasn't done, only paused like a storm gathering beyond the horizon.